live in the YouTube studio, and I'll message in Discord how the audio sounds.
Okay. Are we a go then?
Testing, testing.
We go? Okay.
My coffee says, are we live?
Welcome to MarsCon 2021. Welcome to MarsCon 2021, a virtual science fiction convention broadcast from the Twin Cities to the testing range of the planet, I guess. And the panel, panel or discussion, which we're having here at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time on Saturday, March 13th. Darkness and what is that about? The theme for this year's MarsCon is Forces of Darkness. It happens, we traditionally have one Western panel related to Westerns in films, fiction, etc. at MarsCon. And so combining the theme of Forces of Darkness with the topic of Westerns, we arrived at this that description, Forces of Darkness and Westerns. Well, my name is Eric Heidemann. Is there anybody else who'd like to introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Christine. Good morning, everybody. Hope you got your coffee.
Hi, Christine. Anybody else?
I'm Ben.
Hi, Ben.
How
I
is
guess,
it?
is there one other person?
That do good Ben Cartwright. I'm me and a Ben.
No.
Was there one other person out there in the?
No, just our streamer, John.
Right. Film and literary Westerns almost always center around a struggle between the forces of good and the forces of darkness. We'll look at how the forces of Western darkness change as they reflect changing times. The description goes on to talk about a Western convention on Sarnet sponsoring. We'll deal with that. And being, as mentioned, Westerns usually have some kind of morality conflict presumably between good and evil, or forces of darkness. Good. The question is, which side one thinks of it being the good guys and which the bad guys. I thought we might make a few examples of that and then go into more detail about specific problems. But I think will be the obvious example of evolution and Western portrayal of good and evil would be the relationship, should we say, between Native Americans and American Indians and European settlers. And in that case, the early decades of Western, which would be, say, from the late 19th century on in literature and the early 20th century on in films, would be portrayal of American Indians. Much of that span are purely negative. sometimes they come across, sometimes they're viewed as sentient, and intelligent, but seemingly have villainous motives. Now, as time goes on, that evolves considerably. It's as likely as not that Western release now in the early 21st century would be more likely to give a positive portrayal of the American Indians and a negative portrayal to the settlers who stole their land. Um, that's the standout example. That seems to be the evolution, good versus evil Westerns. Another example would be the conflict between settlers and farmers, between the farmers and the ranchers.
Mic off. Mic feedback off.
Farmers have a set area, try to maintain. Ranchers move around with their cattle. And that's the example of two forces from the Europeans who come into conflict with each other. And in that case, I think it's more complicated. It's not that I can tell, a clear evolution from good to evil in the cases of the farmer versus the rancher. It's pretty much varies throughout the course of Western stories. Then anybody else think of other examples of how the portrayal of good versus evil in Westerns has evolved?
Well, I think, going back, to the Lone Ranger and to a Zorro, it was sort of, a good guy was always a rich and a well off, and usually somewhat a white, and everybody else was more downtrodden, whether they be natives or Mexicans or Irishmen or whatever immigrant groups it seems to be coming through.
But
Yeah.
Zorro was sort of secretly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He was obviously affluent, but he was sort of fighting against his own kind.
Yeah.
In some respects, in favor of more the common man.
Yeah, I mean, all of these. Yeah, I mean, they all have sort of a Robin Hood type of aspect to them. I mean, the Lone Ranger. I mean, he had silver bullets because he owned a silver mine, and he was fairly well off, and
He was a member of the Texas Rangers, right?
possibly I don't remember that aspect.
But his group, whatever they were,
Yeah.
were ambushed, and he was the sole for the conflict. And then Tonto was an enlightened American Indian, discovered the wounded ranger and nursed him back to health, and then became partners.
That is correct. And moving forward, Paladin was a fairly well-off individual who tried to help a common person. Paladin.
Paladin from the TV series Afghan Will Rebel.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Which is a very from the late 50s, early 60s, very sophisticated show.
Yeah, and going back and watching it, it's very even. I've been sort of catching up on some of the westerns lately, and I find it very enlightening that most of the time the hero is definitely trying to help the down, whether they be Indians or Mexicans, and the bad guy is usually some old white guy who wants to get even richer by exploiting, the locals, the townspeople, or whatever. So.
Mm-hmm.
But And moving on, Gunsmoke and Bonanza, once again, fairly well-to-do types of individuals who are, trying to keep everybody in check, trying to make sure that that the uprisings on either side don't get out of hand
Mhm.
and stuff. So
There seems to be, I mean, from what my recollection of the different kinds of westerns that I've seen, it it's really looking a lot about a period of time where there was a lot of sort of innovation happening with the railroad,
Mhm.
and sort of there were forces that had money that were basically trying to make big changes to the way things run, and with little thought to the common man. So the sort of anti-heroes that we're describing with like um, what was the one Paladin
Mhm.
and some of these others, they're kind of
Portrayed by
they're
Richard.
yeah, they're doing well for themselves, but they have a conscience about retaining wealth, that you shouldn't be trampling all over the rights of other people. And so I think the real forces of darkness in a lot of the westerns I've seen are those that are looking to civilize society. You look at like Paint Your Wagon. I mean, that's, obviously that says a lot about me, that's one of my favorite western movies. But it's all about civilizing, and it's perceived as a bad thing, really. I mean, everyone wants to kind of move in that direction, but then when civilization actually comes, they realize it's at a big cost of freedom. And there's a sort of a common thread to that, I think, throughout a lot of um, Western movies, and movies, at least, that I've seen. I haven't read a lot of Western setting books, a few, but that seems to be a common thread, sort of the push and pull between preserving what people have with space and nature, and all the wonderful things that are already there, and yet making progress. And I think progress is sort of the real force of darkness in westerns, in a lot of westerns, at least.
yeah, the coming of a barbed wire and the railroads and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, and more settlers than the land can support.
Yeah.
An example that's coming to mind is the man who shot Liberty Valance. 62, in which the villain of the piece is Liberty Valance, who's a thug with some supporters, who's also represents the spirit of freedom uh, along with his villainy. And James Stewart, a young lawyer, comes into the area and uses the tools of civilization, such as law books, and to make it civilized. But that's complicated. And in terms of the behavior, certainly the James Stewart character is behaving better than the Lee Marvin character, Collins. But the civilization, as it comes, also takes away a lot of the freedom come to the country for.
One thing that I noticed as the Western sort of evolved in the 70s, they the sets and the costumes and the makeup became much more what I would consider realistic. It didn't look like a theater stage set,
Mm-hmm.
and it looked more lived in, and a lot of the props you could see that they look somewhat used. They didn't look you know, store bought that a morning and stuff like that. So, and people dress like, yeah, we don't have washing machines and we haven't had a bath this month yet. So,
There's another force of darkness too, though. The gunslinger. That is a common theme throughout a lot of westerns. The gunslinger is, both he kind of represents, okay, this is like the ultimate freedom. He gets to do what he wants to do, but yet it's at a huge cost of life, and whoever he's, you know, terrorizing is not feeling so good in his company either. But so the gunslinger can represent I guess two sides of the coin. The gunslinger can be the liberator. The gunslinger can also be the person who sort of brings about the doom of the whole, you know, city sometimes.
And you've got various films in which outlaws, such as Billy the Kid and Jesse James and the James Younger gang, are in one sense seen as villains, but there's also the viewer or reader has some sympathy for the
Right.
character.
I think it almost plays directly over into, you know, as you go into the modern age, gangsters, you know, people
Yes.
on the one hand,
Yes.
they did horrible things. They committed crimes. They killed people. And on the other hand, but they were going for, you know, the ultimate freedom, which is you can do what you want.
Yeah. I mean, and when the TBI's, you know, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Alias Smith and Jones, the main thing there, they stressed in the opening thing that, you know, that they were unpopular with the railroads and the banks, but the people all liked them because they went out of their way to make sure that nobody actually got physically hurt.
Mm.
So they were much more of a Jesse, or more of a Robin Hood type of a character. But so you know, they were trying to portray the villains as more human and all likable.
You're gonna have to adjust your kerchief there.
So anyway,
Are we gonna talk out all about like the Clint Eastwood and spaghetti
Sure.
westerns and kind of go?
Yeah,
over?
what does Clint Eastwood stand for? And that's the man with no name movies.
Well, his character evolved too. I mean, as his roles evolved, you know, it was more a cardboard, two dimensional, and his later films, you know, the retiring gunslinger who, you know, really wants to get out of the thing. He's tired of always looking over his shoulder and stuff. And he just really wants to be a tire. He's tired of, you know, living from moment to a moment. And he has regrets about things that he's done. And that's stuff that the early Clint Eastwood didn't have those issues.
So he gets progressively gray and conflicted.
Yeah.
And well, also
Makes sense.
the character that he plays in contemporary urban settings, the Dirty Harry movies, I think is so much follows directly from the early westerns, and the ambiguity they portray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke, you know, pretty much always was on the side of a right, and there was no question. He slept well at night, I would think. I don't know if he ever got to sleep with Miss
Yes.
Kitty, but it was, you know, him and Festus and them, they were always, you know, on the side of, you know, of the law and what was right, and same thing with the Virginian and stuff like that, and High Chaparral, and as the storytelling evolved into other shows, it got much more, much grayer, I think, as far as who was doing what and why.
Again, Paladin is what would you, soldier of fortune, what would you call him? I mean, he's a professional something.
Like a bounty hunter?
Well,
Bounty hunter.
A fixer. I mean, you know, you would telegraph him in San Francisco and say, hey, bad things are happening in my town, please come. And, you know, sometimes he'd get paid, sometimes not, but it really didn't seem to matter to him. Well, occasionally he was well paid for his services, but usually there was some mystery and some intrigue that had to be solved, and nothing appeared exactly the way it did in the opening scene. And sometimes, you know, he would start in the ploy of one individual, and then halfway through the show, he'd realize that the person paying him really is the bad guy, and he really needs to support the other side. So, and he really didn't have much of a problem of switching sides halfway through the episode.
I think there's another force of
I'm,
darkness.
I'm thinking of, again, the relation.
Oh,
Say what?
Forces, yes, force of darkness.
yeah, I was just thinking, there's kind of a thread just because of the timing of some of the way that westerns are set during the gold rush, and this sort of greed and avarice that is at play in society at the time, and how people are, they're looking out for how they're going to advance themselves at the expense of others, and that sort of thing, and exploit resources in order to find the gold and get rich and that sort of thing. I mean, that's kind of like, going back to the paint your wagon as the example. The downfall of society is when you've gotten it to the point where greed and avarice is completely taken over and gutted the city, and it's falling apart.
Yeah. And the characters that Clint Eastwood portrays in numerous westerns are the traditional the guy who comes in from the wild to town and basically cleans up the town. In the Eastwood character, he basically destroys the town, the town that needed cleaning up.
One thing that when I grew up in the 70s, one of the characters, and it was popular for 3 seasons, was Kung Fu, in which the Chinese were exploited. Whoops, hello. Through all of by pretty much everybody, and by federal laws and stuff like that. And he was always fighting racism, and usually fighting a bad guy and trying to be calm and mellow. And then about 45 minutes in, he had all he could stand, and he physically assaulted the bad guys and subdued them, and then moved on to the next town. So
he doesn't kill people, right?
In the pilot and in setting up the situation, he did kill the Emperor's nephew.
Oh.
Because the Emperor's nephew killed his Master Po. And in a bit of a rage, he killed the Emperor's nephew, and that's why he had to flee China and come to the U.S. So yes, he did kill that one kid, but it had it coming.
He doesn't make a habit of it.
No, right? Yeah, killing someone is not his go-to solution.
Yeah, we've got in chat, Geek in the Family is chatting. Glenn Ford, fastest gun alive, comes to mind on gunfighters.
Oh yeah, that Glenn Ford portrays a character who's got the reputation as the fastest gun alive, and therefore people are always challenging him to show that they're faster. And he wants to put that all behind him. He's had enough of it. But people keep finding out about him and coming after him. I think if I audience member can correct, did I have that right?
I think so. Yeah. I haven't seen that movie in this century, so that's...
Ford would be another leading example of a long time Western star.
Yes, very much so. And he very much was an everyman, and just sort of wanted to, get through and do the right thing. But he really wasn't, one to champion and beat his chest. He just really wanted to say, hey, we're here, let's just work it out. Oh, you don't want to work it out, then, well, okay,
yeah.
Plan B. But
it's the common man who is trying to stay neutral and stay out of the situation until finally he's pushed to the point where he has to intervene because not intervening at that point is just morally reprehensible, and you can't.
Right.
There's a time where you have to pick a side, and I guess that becomes the moment of the the drama where the climax of the drama in Western.
Yes. Trying to remember.
I think other forces of darkness would be the
Just a second.
drinking and gambling and sort of the whole saloon mentality, kind of sort of playing to the darker side of humanity. That's really played up a lot in Westerns. You've got people going out and
people getting paid at best $1 per day, 6 days a week, and they come into town on Saturday afternoon and decide to party a bit, and unfortunately, quite often gunplay is involved, and
Fire Creek.
Usually a fist fight of some sort. And what have you got there?
You got an example?
Fire Creek is an example of what you were just talking about, where a character portrayed by James Stewart is, and he is a sheriff, but he's just tried to keep things settled. Then this gang led by Henry Fonda comes into town, and he tries everything he can to get him to leave or to settle down, to behave himself. Finally, he has to go up against him. And of course, another example of that kind of thing would be High Noon, starring Gary Cooper. It's sheriff who's
part of the gambling.
From being the sheriff, and his wife is a Quaker, and is persuading him to put the old gunfighting life behind him, and he ends up, after having tried to get support from the people in the town who he's done many good things for over the years, they all turn their backs on him.
Yeah, they do. I mean, because they feel that that someone's going to die, and they don't want it to be them. So if they stay low, it probably won't be them. But
we've got another comment in chat. Jason Tucker says, I've been watching all of the Hopalong Cassidy movies, where one of the ways that Hoppy shows that he's not a bad guy is by only drinking sarsaparilla. Only bad guys drink whiskey.
Sarsaparilla?
Yeah.
Which was the original soda pop.
Yeah.
And then another comment, Angel and the Bad Man, John Wayne. Oh, we haven't even spoken about John Wayne. John Wayne puts the gunfighting away and finds redemption by the end of the film.
Because of a good woman. That's right.
Yeah.
Cool. I hope he doesn't turn around and spank, honestly.
Now, John Wayne had, of course, a 50-year career, many kinds of films, but especially Westerns. How does he have characters that he portrays have similarities, or do the differences are?
Honestly, I don't know that I've watched him in too many Westerns. I saw him in The Quiet Man. I was made to watch that movie when I was an impressionable teenager, and I didn't like him pursuing Maureen O'Hara across the countryside and spanking her. I thought that John Wayne movies were not my cup of tea at that point. And The Quiet Man, I don't think that was a Western. I think that was based in
Ireland.
a different setting.
In Ireland.
Yeah. Bad impression. I think I watched Donovan's Reef, but that's not a Western either.
Let's see. Interesting. It's being John Wayne from Fort Apache. from, I think, the 40s, starring John Wayne and Henry Fonda. Fonda tends to be the good guys in most of the movies that he was in. And
Have you been keeping up on westerns? I mean, I know there aren't as many westerns as there were when I was growing up. There were westerns all over the place. It was very popular.
Yes.
Are modern westerns a little bit more sensitive to some of the, I think, socially unacceptable things that were going on in old style westerns? Are they getting a little bit more of a sensibility about exploitation of Native Americans or tribal lands and things like that? Are they I doubt that they're romanticizing the Wild West, but I don't know. I just haven't watched too many. I know Tombstone was a big one. That was very popular when I was growing up, but that's a little bit more modern than some of the ones we've been talking about.
well, they gunfight at BOK Corral, right? Still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was that, but then it went beyond it too. So
Yeah. It was very interesting. But I don't think it really goes into those social issues. But I could see Westerns easily re-examining those things.
I think that your overall question, I would say that yes, the contemporary Westerns do have more tendency to have deal moral complexity. So I think yeah.
yeah, the Hateful Eight and Django Unchained come to mind for more modern Western types of films.
Yeah.
I was talking Fort Apache. The Henry Fonda character in this case is he's obviously based on Earl Custer, kind of megalomaniacal character, and simply looks with contempt upon the American Indians. And John Wayne character, second in command at Fort Apache, is one of a rare John Wayne characters. Is enlightened liberal throughout, I would say. He's very sympathetic to the Indians, and he's trying to make things work out, but it ends up being a massacre because of the Henry Fonda character.
Mm. There is a comment in chat. As Eric mentioned, Fort Apache is an early example of sympathetic treatment of Native Americans. And yes,
Yes,
modern films are more complex in their storytelling. So,
Dances with Wolves comes to mind. So.
Oh yeah, that's true. That is definitely set in the West. That's been a while though.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just. It seems like Westerns just do not dominate in the way that they did maybe back in the
60s and 70s.
Late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were all over the place. Television.
I mean,
had
at one point there were 70 TV shows that
Mhm.
all were airing at the same time and all were set in the Old West,
Wow.
as it were. So.
and Gene Roddenberry sold Star Trek to the studios, by referring to it as wagon train in space.
Yep. And that was sort of almost an anthology. You had like 5 or 6 core people who were always there, and then they would move forward to a new situation that had to be resolved. So, they'd come across, somebody whose a wagon was burning, and they abandoned a widow, an orphan, or whatever, and they'd have to try to right the situation and then move along, because they had to keep going because they were trying to get their dozen or so wagons from St. Louis out to the West Coast.
Yes. Another film involving cattle would be Red River, starring John Wayne.
Yep.
Bulk of the because of the cattle drive.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Another observation from Jason in chat. Somewhat surprisingly, a lot of the 30s westerns I've watched have had very little representation of Native Americans. It seems like a lot of the conflict was more against cattle barons or rustlers.
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, I think cattle barons and rustlers do really represent a lot of the forces of darkness in westerns.
Yeah, I would say another example of that is the Fairies from the early 50s, directed by John Stewart, and
Oh, I haven't seen that yet.
starring Barbara Stanwyck. And I think Walter Houston is a very, very complicated character. This involves several different forces interacting with each other, and doesn't have a simple moral position as regards. Definitely worth seeing. Broken Arrow, starring James Stewart from circa 1950, was an example of a white guy who was trying to make peace with the natives, supposedly based on a true historical figure. But yeah, the battle barons is what I mentioned that again towards the beginning. That tends to be the tensions between ranchers and farmers, between the farm, which is where the produce is supposed to stay put, and fences are put up to keep them, whereas ranchers cover a lot of distance, take them to where they can sell them. How would you say the ranchers and the farmers, how do they come up against each other, odds against each other?
Well, yeah, I mean, the two business models really do conflict because the all rancher, there's not enough rain in the West to support a cow on just a couple acres of land. You really need to, and you need to keep the herd moving.
But you need to keep them off the farm.
But
they're
the
gonna
farm
destroy the crops.
has declared, no, these couple acres is where we are, and we can't have, the herd come through and totally mess up the creeks, water, and trample the crops. So, I mean, it's two totally conflicting business models that, unless you have, clear demarcs as to, the cattle
Yes.
can go through here, but not there.
Yeah.
And of course, there is always the nicest spot because people like to live in the valleys next to the rivers and creeks and stuff, and that's kind of where you need to run the cattle so that the cattle don't die of thirst. So
We're kind of starting to run close on time. I noticed one of Ben's notes here talking about blazing saddles. Obviously, that's a farce, but it definitely comes to mind when talking about all of the different elements of westerns that we've been discussing. But on a more serious note, I wondered, Eric, if you'd like to say anything about Dave.
Yeah.
And your con.
Yes.
Before we close.
This panel was sponsored by Con Sarnet, which is a Western convention, which the first 12 editions of which occurred in early June, and then virus came along. We were on hiatus, but we're planning to come back this summer or fall with Con Sarnet 13, and the convention was started by David Christensen, David Christensen and I, and many of you may know him from MarsCon as work as a dealer, very honest dealer, and along with his scholarly approach to many panels at MarsCon and other conventions, a lot of did his homework for various, especially film-related panels. Anybody else have anything to say about David?
I know him just mostly just from the dealer's room, and I believe he was also involved in a lot of panels in Krushenko's over the years. He was a reliable book dealer, and I mean, it's a big loss for the fan community.
Yeah, he's a big guy.
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
if anyone's on the line listening, yeah, if you didn't hear the news, he passed.
earlier this year, just before his 63rd birthday.
Yeah.
I know that he was concerned about last time I talked to him, how things were going with the cons. So I guess it's time to wind up. I think, any other announcements?
Yep. If you're listening, obviously we all want to be together. Hopefully sometime soon. I hope that you are enjoying yourself at MarsCon. Sorry to close the panel on a somber note, but obviously there's a lot of us who are who have lost people over the course of this pandemic and this just weird year that we've all been having. I hope that you are enjoying the aspects of MarsCon that you can, and I certainly hope we'll be back together in person next year. We're planning on it, and hopefully we'll be all back at lots of conventions sooner. I know Eric's in charge of lots of different, or involved in lots of different conventions, and we certainly try to make the rounds to as many conventions as we can. If you're looking for things to do at MarsCon, obviously the panels are great. I think all of the panelists who are doing programs over the course of the weekend, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm hoping that this little element of MarsCon will lift somebody's spirits. And there's lots of other things to do in the Discord as well. So even if you haven't tried Discord before, I recently learned about it myself. Apparently all 4 of my sons go on Discord all the time. So I'm a little late coming to the party, but go ahead, enjoy. If I can learn it, you can learn it. It's not that bad. I know technology is a challenge, and I'm hoping that you can kind of find a new way. I mean, if anybody can embrace a challenge like that with technology, I think science fiction fans can. So I'm hoping that we can include as many people as we can, and we'll be back again together soon.
A couple of local cons that I'm involved in that are presumably coming up in the next few months will be Gunslinger, as mentioned, and Diversicon, which is a multicultural science fiction fantasy convention. And I can't hand you a piece of paper as I normally do these things, but if you want, you can contact me at eheideman@dhzone.com. Eheideman dhzone.com, and I'm happy to get you information about Unsarted and Diversicon. So thank you for coming. And most of the events are going to be posted. Is that the case?
Yep. So if you know somebody who would enjoy the conversation, feel free to invite them to our YouTube channels, and you can view any of the events that you might have missed yesterday or throughout the weekend on our YouTube channels. So thanks, everybody.